The reason why private property is such a valuable discovery by the human race is that it enables us to transform the inert, lifeless things of this world into useful tools, useful land or property or buildings or facilities that we can then benefit from, that we can trade, that we can exploit for our own purposes, and make what it would otherwise be just, rocks and dirt into something that is of value to you, me, and other people. So I would say private property is one of the essential freedoms, even if people don't realize that how much they use it, and yet they do. I mean, we all use private property every day, whether it be a sentimental piece of property that you keep just because your grandfather made it for you, or a wedding ring or anything.
This is Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio.
Welcome back to Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio, the show that spotlights the courageous individuals defending liberty across the globe. Today's guests are a dynamic duo whose legal victories have reshaped American jurisprudence on property rights. And they also happen to be married. We're thrilled to welcome Tim and Christina Sandefur of the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. Tim serves as Vice President for Legal Affairs, and Christina is Executive Vice President. Together, they've co-authored Cornerstone of Liberty, Property Rights in the 21st Century America. And their work continues to inspire legal reforms nationwide. We'll explore how the Goldwater Institute is setting legal precedents that empower individuals, the unique challenges they face in Arizona and beyond, and why their partnership, both professional and personal, is so central to their impact. And hey, if you value the kind of powerful stories you hear on this show, please consider joining our community. A gift of $25 or more not only supports Atlas Network's mission, but it gets you a complimentary subscription to Freedom's Champion magazine, filled with stories of liberty and action across the globe. Well, let's jump right in. Tim, Christina, thank you for being with us. I want to ask you right away, what's one of the most exciting legal wins that you've recently had at the Goldwater Institute that you think people haven't heard enough about or aren't talking enough about?
Well, thank you, Michael. I would say that one of the biggest wins is definitely something people outside of Arizona have not heard about and really should. And that is an incident that occurred up in Flagstaff, Arizona, not long ago. Flagstaff is a community north of Phoenix that's up in the mountain area. And it's a lovely community to visit, but sometimes it's not such a great place to own private property. What happened was that the city imposed restrictions on property use and that violate a law that Arizona adopted, that we at the Goldwater Institute helped write about 20 years ago now.
Almost 20 years. Next year will be 20 years.
Called Proposition 207, that was adopted by the voters. And what this law does is it says if the government takes away your property through eminent domain, of course, it owes you just compensation, as everybody knows. But if the government restricts your ability to use your property, that can be tantamount to taking it away. It's basically the same thing if they won't let you use your land. And so our Proposition 207 says the government also owes you just compensation when it does that. However, there's an exception. It says that if the government can't afford it or doesn't want to pay the compensation, it doesn't have to. Instead, what it can do is it can adopt a waiver saying, well, we won't implement this law against your private property, and then you won't lose your right to use it, and we don't have to pay you. And so as a result of this law, when Flagstaff adopted its restriction on property owners in the city, we went around to the city, to the property owners in the town. We said, you should file one of these protests and demand compensation or a waiver. And the city was very cooperative and signed these waivers. How many waivers was it that they signed?
Over 100. And in fact, it was about $124 million worth of property that would have been taken away. And so, and that is the really interesting thing about this law that we wrote is it puts a price tag on regulation. I mean, bureaucrats that want to regulate for aesthetic purposes or, when they want to decide how property should be used, they oftentimes don't think about what that cost is to the property owner.
They think of it as free.
Yeah, exactly. And so when we pass this law, it actually sends a bill to these bureaucrats and tells them, well, this is how much money you're going to cost these property owners. And of course, if it really is worth it to the city to tell people that they can't build on their property, they can't improve their property, they can't convert property from commercial to residential. That was one of the restrictions, which of course in a post-COVID world, a lot of commercial property would be better used as residential. If the city decides for, whatever reason that it wants to place those restrictions on people's property, then it ought to pay for it. And if it's too expensive for the city, then it's definitely too expensive for the property owner. And therefore, the city has a choice. Pay or waive the restriction. So yeah, this was over 100 properties, hundreds of millions of dollars.
And what we've done at the Institute is we have updated that Proposition 207. We've tinkered with it a little bit to fix some little things that need to be changed. And we now call it the Property Ownership Fairness Act. And we're in the process of trying to persuade people in other states to adopt a similar the Property Ownership Fairness Act to protect landowners throughout those states also.
Yeah, and it really is about fairness. That's what we like about it, because the law does say that if government is regulating in a way that is necessary to protect health and safety, then it doesn't have to pay. And of course, as those of us who believe in constitutionally limited government, that is government's only purpose, right? Is to protect people's rights. And so it has the power, the legitimate power to regulate to protect health and safety. But anything beyond that, any kind of, again, like aesthetic regulation, any kind of when the government just wants to tell people what to do with their property, well, then they have to pay. It doesn't say the government can't regulate, but it says that the cost can't be borne by the property owner. So then it really helps internalize those costs that were previously externalized, and people see how expensive regulation is, and they can make choices accordingly.
Obviously, with such impact that's already happened in Arizona and such success that you've had, I would imagine many in Arizona understand this or are learning about it. But you mentioned going to other states as well, working with peer organizations and with municipalities and legislatures across the country. So you're going to encounter the question, I'm sure, but an individual who's not really worried about zoning restriction, they've never paid attention to it. Why is the issue of property rights matter to them? How do you address that question when you get it?
Well, private property, I would answer that in two ways. The first one is that private property is essential as a human right. It is absolutely critical for your ability to pursue happiness, that you be able to own and use land in peaceful ways that allow you to benefit yourself and your community. And that would be the second part of my argument, which is that even if you aren't a developer or a property owner or whatever, you nevertheless benefit from a society where private property rights are respected and where people can decide how their land is used and what to do with the things that they own, whether to buy it, sell it, renovate it, use it themselves, et cetera, et cetera. The reason why private property is one of the great discoveries of the human race, and I use that term intentionally, discoveries. Private property is not an invention. It's not something that we create. It is something that we recognize and acknowledge about how we live. And the reason why private property is such a valuable discovery by the human race is that it enables us to transform the inert, lifeless things of this world into useful tools, useful land or property or buildings or facilities that we can then benefit from, that we can trade, that we can exploit for our own purposes, and make what it would otherwise be just, rocks and dirt into something that is of value to you, me, and other people. So I would say private property is one of the essential freedoms, even if people don't realize that how much they use it. And yet they do. I mean, we all use private property every day, whether it be, a sentimental piece of property that you keep just, because your grandfather made it for you, or a wedding ring or anything, whether it's that or whether it's investment property. This stuff has value to us because it's how we facilitate the pursuit of happiness.
And we tell stories. I mean, this is one of the important, most critical parts to the work that we do, whether we're going across the country passing legislation or whether we are suing the government when it violates people's rights in court. we try to tell stories about how these regulations impact your average individual, your average family, and property rights are just essential to your average individual. Sometimes you were mentioning that people don't necessarily think that property rights affect them. And it's true that a lot of people, when they think about property rights, they think about big businesses or corporations or millionaires that have mansions. And they think, well, in my humble little abode, property rights really don't apply to me. I don't own very much. But in fact, property rights are most critical to those types of people, to your average American, because somebody who's wealthy and well-connected has the resources and the connections to be able to protect their property. And in fact, sometimes they exploit those connections with government to take other people's property. But it's your average individual who, property rights are essential to be able to protect them from overreach, from eminent domain abuse, as we mentioned before, from excessive regulation.
You could say property is your essential shield against the government, so that if you don't own a politician, you better own some land.
So one of the things I love most about getting to do this program are the unique stories and the individuals throughout the worldwide freedom movement, courageous leaders like yourselves that I get to interact with and talk to, but it's not very often that I get to talk with a couple that are fighting for freedom together. So I just want to ask, what's that like? What's the opportunity to work together about something you're both passionate about?
Well, we have very strict rules about this is mine and that is yours.
Property rights are very important in our household. No, it's great. This working in this line of work, defending freedoms. I mean, it's really been a lifelong passion for me. I am the child of recent immigrant families on both sides, and I was raised just always hearing about how important it is to work hard and to earn, the fruits of your labor, and that if you earn something, then nobody can take it away from you. And I was always reminded how lucky I was to live in America and be able to pursue the American dream. And so that sort of shaped the type of career that I wanted to have. And early in my career, I actually became aware of Tim through his books. What are you up to, 20 now that you've written? I feel like every other week he's written a brand new book, but
it's 9.
9. Well, you're halfway to 20. But anyway, I had read a few of his books, and then we met doing work for fighting for freedom. And you were in the midst of writing a book about economic liberty, which, besides private property rights, is one of my greatest passions. And he asked me to edit it. Probably didn't know that I was going to take that very seriously.
It's a great pickup line, guys. If you, hey, baby, you want to edit my 300-page book on economic liberty in the Constitution?
So we had lots of conversations about that, and just, found out we shared similar passions, got to know each other. And the funny thing is, we started working together on the property rights book that we co-authored before we actually worked together at the Goldwater Institute. Tim was working for the Pacific Legal Foundation. I was working for the Goldwater Institute. In fact, we lived apart for the first 3 years of our marriage because we were so dedicated to the organizations that we worked for. And remote work wasn't really a thing then. So we wrote that book together. We even sent out announcements. It's a book to all of our friends to let them know we were welcoming
baby announcements, except for the book. So. The best part was where it's weight, like 3 ounces.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We did put that in. But it's just, it's a lot of fun when freedom. To me, it's such a pleasure and an honor to be able to fight for freedom every day. It's critical for our country. And I think when you have a partner that values it just as much, it just...
Yeah, and on that topic, I would say you use the term courageous. I would say that actually it's our clients and the people that we work with and try to protect. They're the ones who are courageous, especially in our legal work. So The Goldwater Institute does legislation, like we just talked about Prop 207, for instance. We also do litigation where we go to court to represent people. And of course, we do scholarship and legal and policy analysis, the kind of research and white papers that most people think of when they think about think tanks. Well, I would say it's our clients, especially. They're the ones who show the courage, because it takes a lot of guts to stand up for your rights when the government and maybe even your entire community might be up against you. And a lot of time these people are harassed or they're not. They feel intimidated. They don't want to stand up and draw attention to themselves. And they're the people that we admire most. And it's really a privilege to work with them and help protect them.
We're talking about your impact and your efforts in Arizona, but you have impact beyond the Arizona borders. In fact, I would argue that Goldwater Institute has become a model for many across the country, that many of our peer organizations look at the success you all have had and try to learn from it. How have you been able to do that, or why do you think there's a secret sauce at what you all do there that is having impact beyond your borders?
Well, I'm not sure this would be a helpful answer to a lot of organizations, because they already know the answer, which is people. The absolutely indispensable ingredient is getting the right team of people who are willing to put in the kind of work that it requires and obtain the kind of knowledge and experience that it requires. It doesn't happen overnight. And it requires that you have a really special team. And we are very fortunate at the Institute that we have a very special team of lawyers, of policy and analysts and lobbyists and scholars who are willing to work with us. And that's developed. The Institute was founded in 1988. So it took a long time to develop that team. And that's really the key to the success we've accomplished.
Well, I would say one of the most important characteristics of that team, though, and of those people, is that we just care about getting the work done. We care about winning for freedom. And it really doesn't matter to us who gets the credit. And we certainly realize that we can't do it alone. So we love working with our partners in the Atlas Network. And when we work outside of our state of Arizona, we're typically doing that in partnership with some other organization. So, if we go to Tennessee, we'll work with the Beacon Center, or if we go to Ohio, we're working with Buckeye. And sometimes it's national partners. A lot of times it's directly with the Atlas Network. And, we know what makes us strong. We have great researchers. We have unique ideas. We're able, because of our in-house legal team, we're able to craft laws that will make a difference, that will empower people to live freer, happier lives, and that we can enforce in court. And we try a lot of them out in Arizona, get the kinks worked out. And then we go to somewhere else and we partner with the folks that, maybe know their legislators better than we do on the ground, or maybe have some other kind of insight that we don't have about that particular location. And that's what makes us greater by working together. And, the other side, so to speak, those who would, wish to suppress freedom and increase the power of government, they have unlimited resources. They have all of our money because they get our tax dollars. And so we're up against, it's a David versus Goliath situation. And so we have to work together, and working together makes us stronger. And so I think, there's that great Ronald Reagan quote, which of course, Tim always memorizes every quote verbatim, and I am never can recite them verbatim. But there's no limit to what you can do if you don't care who gets the credit, which of course isn't the exact quote.
No, I think that's right.
But I have, he kept that on his desk at the White House, and I have a replica of it on my desk, and we really live by that here at the Goldwater Institute, because our feeling is, we can do a lot more together if we all work together. And we work in red states and blue states and purple states all across the country. We have done things in California where, it hasn't been helpful for us to be the first name or the front runner on the work that we're doing, because unfortunately there, if you're not a Democrat, a lot of times your ideas just they're not heard, even though they're good ideas and they're not partisan ideas. And so, it's better maybe for a local Democrat to be the face of the idea, and we just help in the background, and we're fine with that.
Yeah. So, and to put those two answers together, I would say that we've succeeded because of the people on our team, But if there are organizations out there that, I know a lot of these organizations, it's like one person, in other states. And if they are in need of people to help them, give us a call, and
Always.
we will do what we can to help you to advance the ball for freedom.
And to your point, Tim, 37 years, I think, if I'm doing the math correctly, of experience and impact that you all have had that I think a lot of peer organizations could definitely learn from. But talking a lot about, Christina, you mentioned some of that collaboration. Is there a particular story or an experience that you all have had in collaborating with a partner throughout the worldwide freedom movement that you wouldn't mind sharing or describing here, that maybe that's a success story that others can learn from, that just the story hasn't been told enough?
Yeah, well, and we've had so many amazing partnerships throughout my, over 16 years now that I've been at the Goldwater Institute. But one of my favorites is the Right to Try movement, which, of course, the Atlas Network has been very supportive of. Now, we've been talking a lot about property rights. Right to Try is about healthcare freedom. But of course, what greater property right does one have than the right to be able to use their body as they see fit, and take, in the case of Right to Try, life-saving medications that are maybe not yet government approved, but the only option out there for somebody who is desperate. And so, this is a concept, obviously, that we didn't invent at the Goldwater Institute. The FDA, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, in Washington, D.C., has been increasingly regulatory and has really expanded its scope, has stood in the way of the doctor-patient relationship. And it's gotten to the point where regulations are so numerous that it can take 10 to 15 years for potentially life-saving medication to get approved. And that means, in the meantime, that desperate patients who need those options are out of luck. And so what we invented, though, what we decided to do that was novel, is to start at the state level, because the bureaucratic inertia in Washington, D.C., nothing was getting done. Patients had tried for decades with very little success. So we said, why don't we bring this back to the people and to the states? So we crafted a law that we've actually first ran in Colorado. And the reason that we did that instead of Arizona, at the time, Arizona was a Republican-dominated state, and we wanted to demonstrate that this idea that people should have the right to try to save their own lives with medicines that have been deemed safe by the government, but are still working their way through years and years and years of testing before the government gives its stamp of approval, that this is not a partisan idea. And so we went to Colorado, which at the time was a purple state. We had a Republican and Democrat co-sponsor, and got the law passed there. Then we partnered with not just one organization, but dozens of organizations across the country, so that what we wanted to demonstrate is that there is such a desire for this law. And again, that there are patients, there are doctors, there are Republicans, Democrats, moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, everybody wanted this. And we had to do that very quickly. We wanted to be able to create intense momentum so that we could show Washington, D.C. that the time was to act. And so we partnered with organizations across the country. Many of them in the Atlas Network are freedom brethren, but also non-traditional allies, and folks, in patient communities and in the medical community, and people on the left and right and everything in between. 41 states passed right to try laws in just a little over 4 years. I know of no other movement of that type of consequence that has ever garnered that much support at the state level in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, I think the last example that I can think of that's like that would be prohibition in the 1920s, because 41 states, that's enough states to amend the U.S. Constitution.
Yes, and I think it's a beautiful testament to federalism, because after 41 states acted, Congress could no longer turn a blind eye. People were receiving treatments and living years longer than they were, some of them still alive today, when they had been previously handed down death sentences because they were getting treatments they wouldn't have otherwise accessed, and they were doing it under state protective laws. And so finally Congress said, well, I guess something needs to change. It passed. Right to Try became law in 2018. It was signed into law, bipartisan votes, in fact, unanimous vote in the United States Senate, which I also can't remember the last time that something like that happened. And so, and that was all because of federalism. It was because of the states, and it was because of partnerships. You know, the Goldwater Institute, we came up with the strategy, we wrote the law, but we couldn't have done that without the partnerships that we formed across the country. And now, because we have those trusted partnerships, we're able to utilize those to work on other projects. So like the property rights project we mentioned for, for next year, economic liberty, things like that.
I love that you shared that story. It is truly inspiring, the impact, the lives that are directly touched and transformed. Also neat that it's started with a partnership in Colorado. Shouts out to Independence Institute, John Caldera and the team up there. But I want to come back to property rights. You touched on that again. I mentioned at the beginning the book. So Cornerstone for Liberty, since putting that together, have you seen an evolution in the property rights discussion, and how so?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know about an evolution. I think it's more of some people are kind of chomping at the bit to see real reform, especially at the federal level when it comes to private property. And the reason why is because we just passed the 20th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Kelo versus New London, which is an infamous Supreme Court case that upheld the use of eminent domain to, well, I was about to say steal, to condemn somebody's home to tear down and replace it with luxury condominiums. And the U.S. Supreme Court said there was nothing in the Fifth Amendment that prohibits that, even though the Fifth Amendment says that property can only be taken for public use. And, we could debate all day what public uses are, but the one thing that's crystal clear is that it's not private use. And yet the Supreme Court said private uses were good enough if the government thinks it's a good idea. And newsflash, the government always thinks that whatever it does is a good idea. So basically what the Kelo decision did was it removed that constitutional restriction from the Fifth Amendment that says government can only take property for public use. So because it's been 20 years, there's been hope that maybe the Supreme Court will take up this issue again and overrule that case. And they've been asked, and so far they have not said yes. Now, in the 20 years that have elapsed, you have basically a whole new court. I mean, a lot of the personnel who were on the court at that time are gone. I think is Justice Thomas the only one left, I think, from that case?
It might be.
He's certainly one of the only ones, if he's not the only one. And so the time certainly is right, but it hasn't happened yet. So I think the property rights community is a little frustrated. But, law is a slow process. And eventually, I think they're going to have to revisit that. And of course, again, in the meantime, states are where eminent domain is most often used and where the protections against its abuse are best located.
And I do see it sort of, maybe not so much of an evolution as like a rekindling of interest at the state level about property rights. So, after the Kelo case, obviously that case shocked the nation, and people all over the political spectrum were horrified about the consequences because, that case essentially said that nobody's property is safe, nobody's home is safe. And of course, Suzette Kelo is the type of person we were talking about earlier in the conversation. She had a very modest home that she put her blood, sweat, and tears into fixing up. It was something she worked for years to be able to call her own. She was not rich. She was not well connected. And that's why her house was taken from her, because government decided that it would be better use of that property to give it away to wealthy businesses. And so that really woke people up. And so a series of states around the time that in Arizona, we passed our Prop 207, a series of states passed eminent domain reform. And in the book, we kind of detail that, some of this was sort of lackluster. Most states have said you can't take private property for private use. They've clarified that since the Supreme Court got it wrong. There are a lot of steps that the states didn't take, but what most of them didn't do is move on to that regulatory piece. So like we said, when government takes away your property rights through regulation in Arizona, they have to pay you for that. And that discourages excessive regulation and needless regulation. Most states don't have that protection. And it was that was sort of the moment to get it done. And people have kind of since forgotten about the Kelo decision. So for a while, we were really unable to make a lot of inroads on property rights reform. But I would say, now Americans across the country are, suffering from unaffordable housing. There's a great demand for housing, and there is not a great supply, and housing is getting extremely expensive. And really there are many reasons for this, but certainly the main reason in many states is because of excessive regulation, because it takes years to build houses that should only take months, because of all of the permissions you have to get from government. And of course, when you go through a lengthy years-long process to get permission to be able to build from the government, that adds thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars into the cost of the house, which is passed on to the consumer, the family, the individual who wants to purchase that house. And so we've been having conversations across the country with folks who realize that, and this is coming from the left as much as the right, that realize that the government is standing in the way of people being able to have affordable housing. And so there's a real interest in scaling back on some of these unnecessary regulations that have nothing to do with health and safety. But and so we're very hopeful that states next year and in the coming years will take up our Property Ownership Fairness Act, and embrace it, and that there will sort of be like a revival of property rights.
Yeah, I think another factor in favor of that is there's been an increased attention to the dangers of administrative agencies, of bureaucracies, and the risk that they pose both to freedom and to democracy, because we're talking about unelected officials a lot of the time who are making the rules, investigating these rules, and enforcing the rules, combining the judicial, executive, and legislative powers together. And I think because of the increased attention to that problem in recent years, I think that's another reason why people might be more amenable to saying, maybe they shouldn't be telling us what to do with our land,
We talked about quotes earlier, and in this conversation, and when you mention eminent domain, I immediately think of a government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you have. I mean, that's just what eminent domain. But a skeptic would say, hey, there's a balance here for the public good, and we have to be thoughtful about this. I am sure that you've encountered this skeptical question more often than I have. So how has Goldwater Institute addressed that and had that conversation with the public?
Well, the problem with the saying, that there's a balance between public and private concerns and stuff is that it's what the philosopher Daniel Dennett called a deepity, which was his term for something that is true only in the obvious sense, and in the part of that sounds clever, it's not true. And that's what a phrase like that is it's a deepity, because what's true is, yeah, of course you have to be concerned about public impacts, and of course there's a balance between public and private concerns. But when people use that phrase, what they often mean is that the public, that is the government's right to dictate how you live your life, should take precedence over your own choices. And that's definitely not true. The whole point of property rights is that you have a sanctuary where the state cannot legitimately intrude, at least not without a warrant, right? Or as we like to say in the law, a person's home is his or her castle. And that's an ancient principle that is rooted in the necessity of the individual for autonomous space, an autonomous realm where he or she can make decisions about his or her own life and the pursuit of happiness. So it is true. Of course, you need to be concerned about things like pollution, for example. There's an area where there's legitimate public concerns about how people use their property. If they're polluting the river, then that's going to harm other people and so forth. But as many scholars of property rights and environmental law have pointed out, the real problem with the environment is that property rights are too often unenforceable in the environment. And that's just the problem, is that these things aren't owned by anybody, or these resources are owned in the abstract by the government as a whole or something like that, so that nobody's really responsible for them. And that's why you find incidents like a few years ago when the EPA itself poured tons of stinking yellow pollution into the Animas River in Colorado. Nobody was ever called to account for that. Nobody was ever arrested and thrown in jail for that. Nobody was fined for that, because it was the government that did it. And that's why you find that the most polluted places on the planet are those places with the weakest property rights and the most powerful governments. That is primarily communist countries like China and the former Soviet Union, the dirtiest, most polluted places in the world. So the idea that, well, we have this public-private balance and therefore the government should control things is really a non sequitur and a really dangerous one.
I like that you brought up this concept of property rights throughout the world, and really where we see some environmental challenges and where that ties in. So it begs the question about your engagement with Atlas Network and the partnership with Goldwater Institute and Atlas Network. What has that partnership meant to your work? How have you benefited from being a peer organization and partner with the Atlas Network?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, we've benefited in a couple of ways domestically, as we've mentioned multiple times during this podcast. It's connected us to other organizations across the country so that the immense impact that we've been able to have in Arizona, we've been able to take to, the other 49 states. And we've done that through our working with our other partners in the Atlas Network. But I also think, there's such an amazing international component to the work that the Atlas Network does, and it's really given us a lot of perspective. I know that some of our work here at Goldwater has been honored by the Atlas Network and featured alongside work that's being done in other countries. And it's really humbling.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. It's a humbling experience to read about the challenges they face.
Because, and don't get me wrong, I mean, we have serious concerns for freedom in this country. And these days, especially, things are very challenging, and Americans should be very worried about what their government is doing and where their rights stand. And we have to be ever vigilant in protecting those rights. But that said, it's good to get some perspective and to understand how good we still have it here in the United States compared to countries all over the world. And that, here, at least most Americans, still fight for their freedom. They value freedom, and our government is still constrained by our Constitution to a degree. And when it acts outside of the Constitution and violates our rights, we can go to court and we can sue the government and we can protect our rights. And, in many of the partner organizations in the Atlas Network, you can't do that.
We were just talking to a group of international students just yesterday who came to visit the Institute, and one of them was from Uganda. And when we were talking about our work, when we were done, he said, well, in Uganda, in theory, you can sue the government. It's written into the Constitution, but you sure better not do it.
Yeah, he said you'll end up in jail or worse. And, and so when we hear about our partners in other countries that are, doing things that are making such a difference in, securing property rights or, protecting very basic rights that we take for granted here in the United States. It's very humbling, but it's also very inspiring, because if they can make that kind of progress in those countries, then, we ought to be able to stand up and protect what we hold so dear here in the United States, so that we can be a beacon to the rest of the world for freedom, and they can continue to want to emulate us and not the other way around.
Folks, you can go to atlasnetwork.org or wherever you consume podcasts. You will see some conversations with some peer organizations throughout the continent of Africa that are addressing many of the issues like Tim just talked about. And as Christina brought up, you'll learn stories of peers throughout Atlas Network that are part of the worldwide freedom movement. And you'll also learn about the Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner coming up this November in New York City, as it does every year. You can find ways that you can participate there. And so, Tim, Christina, let me ask you about Atlas Network events. Christina, you mentioned before Goldwater Institute has been highlighted and celebrated for the work that you all have done at some of these events. Give a peer that may be watching this right now or listening to this program that's never attended an event before, give them a look at what that's like and why it matters for your organization to be involved.
It's so exciting. You mentioned the Freedom Dinner. We were honored several years ago for our work on Right to Try. I stood up on the stage with peers from all across the world whose work was being honored, I felt tremendously grateful to have the Atlas Network recognize us for the work that we put in, but also it was amazing to be able to connect with folks and meet these people that are doing this incredible work across the country. In fact, it was at an Atlas Network event that I first met Yeonmi Park, who escaped from North Korea. And many people listening to the podcast have probably read her 2 excellent books. I met her before her first book even came out through the Atlas Network. And again, it was so inspiring. Here's someone who's barely a teenager who never knew freedom, lived under the Kim regime, the oppressive regime in North Korea. But she said the human spirit longs to be free, and she and her mother were able to, they risked their lives many times, were able to escape North Korea. And she's now an advocate for freedom thanks to the support of the Atlas Network. And it's incredibly inspiring. And I'll tell you again, when we have, look, we're a merry group here. We're optimists, but it can get you down sometimes when you're constantly fighting City Hall. And we have a lot of wins here at the Goldwater Institute, but you lose sometimes too. And again, as I said, the government has a lot of resources that they pile against us. And so when you meet people like we've been able to meet through the Atlas Network and see the good work that they're doing and the success they have, and the fact that somebody like Yeonmi Park still has so much optimism and still believes in the good in people and has fought for freedom, even with everything that she's had to endure. It keeps you going, and it keeps me optimistic for the future. And it makes me so grateful to live in a country like the United States. And it makes me want to fight like hell to preserve those freedoms.
I love that. That's powerful. A couple last questions. And one of them, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, let's imagine someone's listening to this program and they're at atlasnetwork.org right now and considering contributing to the worldwide freedom movement and supporting the grants that go to organizations like Goldwater Institute for the work that you all do. But they're thinking, I don't know if it's such a big pond. These are such complex issues. Can I really make a difference? Is it really going to matter? So what would you say to a philanthropist or just someone who's looking at volunteering or contributing some of their treasure to help the freedom movement expand? What's the message from you all today about how they should participate?
Actually, it's funny you put it that way, because the first thing that pops into my mind is something that I heard Atlas's Tom Palmer say many years ago now. Dr. Palmer is one of my great heroes in life, and we've both known him for
decades.
Yeah, too long to mention. And his work, is, we were talking about people who face greater dangers than we do. It's amazing. I would recommend anybody just look up the kind of missions that he goes on internationally in defense of freedom. It's truly breathtaking. And on top of that, a brilliant scholar who has taught us both a great deal about the philosophy and history of freedom. I urge anybody to read his marvelous book, Realizing Freedom. But years ago, he was speaking at an event, and his bottom line was, make freedom a small part of your life. It doesn't have to be your daily mission. It doesn't have to be your career like it is for us. We're happy to do that work, but just make freedom a part of your life every day. Just a little bit that you think about and care about, and do something to promote freedom every day, just a little bit. And that is enough, because, we're not, it's in totalitarian states where you have to spend your whole life thinking about politics. The whole point of freedom is that you don't have to spend all your life worried about politics. So don't let it dominate your life if you don't want to, but do make it something that you think about every day, and that you try to do something to help protect and advance freedom, either in America or in other countries every day.
And I can tell you that every dollar makes a difference. I know that sounds like a cliche. People say that, but as somebody who, puts a budget together for an organization that does this kind of work every single year, every dollar counts. Every dollar makes a difference. And, the ability of the Goldwater Institute or the other organizations that are part of the Atlas Network to do the work that we do, it can make just a small donation. They add up, and it can make a difference of us being able to pass a law or not, or win a lawsuit or not, any of the things that our organizations do. So,
and if it's not money, it's time. And it doesn't even have to be devoting your time to it. Just make your voice heard. And let people know if it's a letter to the editor of a newspaper, or if it's just contacting your state-based organization for freedom and putting your name on their list, because you never know, in 5 years from now, maybe they'll need you for something. Maybe they'll need help on something that you can help out with. So just make sure that you stand up and be counted.
Or just share this, listen to this podcast and share it. Goldwater Institute has some podcast series. Listen to them and share them. But that makes a difference. I mean, some of the things that we're talking about today, these are things that, Tim and I discuss day in and day out. But some of your friends or acquaintances might have never thought about these. We talked about how property rights, a lot of people misunderstand how critical and important they are for everyday Americans. So share this podcast with somebody. Now they might think a little bit differently. That's how we change hearts and minds. And ultimately, that's how we protect our freedoms.
So let's wrap up by bringing it home a little bit. This is the part of the program I always love to ask my guests about their neck of the woods and to share their experience with us. Candidly, I got to spent 13 months in the Valley of the Sun there, and I refer to it as the great summer of my life when I was there. And so I have fond memories and look forward to coming back out to Arizona here in the near future. But for those of our audience that have never been, or maybe making their first trip to experience Arizona, where is, like, if we were having this conversation at the office and we were going to go eat after this, where are we going? What's something we need to do?
Best Mexican food is a place called Serrano's. They have 3 locations, I think, in the Phoenix area, mostly in the East Valley. Best Italian food is Sam and Luca's in Mesa. And the best chocolate chip cookies in the entire state are served at the Phoenix Zoo. So make sure you get there.
Hold on. Chocolate chip cookies at the zoo? How did we stumble on this, Tim?
Every time we visit the zoo, that's the first thing we do is go buy 2 cookies at least, because you have to save one for tomorrow with your coffee.
I'll tell you, you talk about advocacy making a difference. The Phoenix Zoo actually removed, these are baked fresh daily cookies, and they switched over to prepackaged cookies. Tim actually wrote a letter to the zoo and asked them to bring back the cookies, and now they're back.
And
so
they did.
Every
one person
individual
can make a difference.
But we have wonderful, a great food scene here in Phoenix and in Arizona.
We have a lot of refugees from California bringing the good restaurants, and refugees from the Midwest bringing the good restaurants.
And we have wonderful Mexican food. And I'll tell you, I've lived here 16 years, but I grew up in Michigan and I've lived throughout the country. And I never realized that there are multiple kinds of Mexican food until I came to Arizona. And now we don't say, would you like Mexican food? We say, do you want Sonoran Mexican food? Or do you
Mexico
want
City? You want to go to Barrio Queen.
Yeah. So it's really great.
And as far as things to see, of course, the Grand Canyon is pretty far from here. So if you're visiting Phoenix, that's a long trip. If you're only in Phoenix for a while, the thing I urge people to see is Taliesin West, which was the winter home of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. He fell in love with Arizona in the 1920s and 30s, and he established a winter home here where he taught his students architecture. And there's a lot of Wright buildings in the Phoenix area. But you can take a tour of Taliesin West, and I think Wright was the greatest visual artist in American history. So if you have a chance to see that, I recommend it.
If you're outdoorsy, though, Arizona is wonderful. If you're just
but don't hike Camelback Mountain in the summer.
Yes.
There's always some fool who goes out there and brings like 1 bottle of water, and then they have to be rescued by helicopter. Don't do that.
But there is wonderful hiking just in the Phoenix area. We're a valley because we're surrounded by mountains. But you go up north, you can go to Flagstaff. The highest peak in Arizona is in Flagstaff, called Humphreys Peak. It's about 12,600 feet, and it is an unbelievable experience, a beautiful view. And the Grand Canyon, everybody knows about the Grand Canyon, but you don't truly know it until you've seen it. I had the pleasure of being able to hike it rim to rim. Several years ago.
She hiked it rim to rim in a single day.
Did it in one day, and I'll tell you, I've never. It's an experience.
Only a fool would do something like that.
But
No, she loved it.
So it's a wonderful place to be outdoors. You can walk, you can run, you can bike, you can
I
hike.
stayed at the hotel with my feet up, drinking an iced tea like a normal person.
You guys have been such a pleasure to have on the program. I'm not surprised, because you're such a pleasure to work with and have had so much impact. I want to give kind of the last thought of the program to you all. Is there any advice that you have for your peers throughout the worldwide freedom movement that may be looking to take on that David and Goliath moment for a challenge, or maybe they've got a passion to write a book, but they don't think they're able to do so? Is something that you've had experience with? What advice would you give to your peers?
I'll go first. I'll say the rule is you have to always be the most prepared person in the room. And that means that you need to study and learn about these ideas, all the arguments against them as best you can, and the responses to those arguments. There's a reason why James Madison is the father of the U.S. Constitution. That's because he showed up there the first, and he had the most preparation, and he was ready to go from the beginning. And that's what you need to do if you're going to be an advocate for freedom. It is not enough as a professional advocate for freedom to just go in there and say, I think freedom's good. You have to know why people are opposed to it and have responses to that in the legal, historical, economic, and even sometimes artistic answers to the objections that they might have. So it takes a lot of preparation, but there are plenty of resources out there to take advantage of. And if you need help, reach out. Yep. If not Goldwater, reach out to some of our sister organizations, Pacific Legal Foundation, Cato Institute, any of the organizations out there. We're happy to help.
Yep. And it is possible to win. And I think that's, it can be, it's this constant refrain that we hear people say, these are difficult times, and it's true, but our country has been through difficult times before, and the world has been through even more difficult times. And, be resilient and keep fighting the good fight, because it is possible to win victories for freedom. We've done it. We're going to continue to do it. And I mean, that's what living and thriving is all about. There's a line from an old Jewish scholar that I remember that really stuck in my mind, which was, it is not your obligation to do it all, but you are also not permitted to do nothing.
Oh, that's good. That is good. And we're going to leave it there and put a pin in that, Tim. I appreciate that. Tim, Christina Sandefur, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations to all the incredible work and the success that you're having with Goldwater Institute. And folks, I encourage you to look up Goldwater Institute or go to atlasnetwork.org, where you can see Tim and Christina's work and their peers at Goldwater Institute and all the success they're having. And while you're there, you can join the Atlas Club. Join my wife, Kayla, and I in being part of the Atlas Club, where you can support many organizations throughout the worldwide freedom movement. And of course, go to Spotify, Apple, YouTube, anywhere that you consume your podcasts, and subscribe to Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio. And until next time, we'll be back with more on this program. Take care and have a blessed day.